Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for our presentation. My name is Sang Woo. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Purdue University, and it is a pleasure to introduce my wonderful colleagues, James Breton, professor of psychology and social data analytics at Penn State University, Melissa Keith, an assistant professor of psychology at Bowling Green State University, and Louis Tay, William C. Byam, associate professor of psychology at Purdue University. We're a group of scholars in the field of industrial and organizational psychology, or we call it IO psychology. We first got together as a team back in summer 2020 to collaborate on a paper on the topic of bias, fairness, and validity in graduate admissions, which is now accepted for publication in Perspectives on Psychological Science. So before we begin this presentation, first, I'd like to share 3 short stories. So the first story goes like this. Almost 3 years ago at a holiday party, I had a conversation with a friend who is a faculty member in another department at Purdue. And she was excited to tell me that her department had unanimously voted to eliminate the GRE requirement for their grad admissions, so that they can further diversify their applicant pool by allowing more students to be considered from underrepresented minority backgrounds. She told me that she was excited to see her department's grad admission process to become more fair and more inclusive. And I expressed my deep concerns about this because of what I know from the psychology literature. And my friend was kind enough to hear me out and ask for more information so that she and her colleagues could discuss it further as things progress. The second story, a couple of years ago, I was chatting with my faculty colleague in psychology here at Purdue, and the conversation started with our shared interest in social justice, both at Purdue and in greater community of higher education. We strongly agreed on the importance of addressing the issue of racial justice. And this was back in 2019, which was before the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movements in the United States. At the beginning of our conversation, we're so glad to find each other on the same page about the problems of racial disparities and years of mistreatment and injustice imposed on Black Americans on so many levels. But then we started talking about GRE. My colleague seemed shocked to hear that I disagreed with her view, which is that GRE is racially biased and discriminatory, and it doesn't predict anything, and therefore it should be abolished from the grad admissions process altogether. And as you can imagine, this was a pretty challenging conversation to have because I didn't want to be misunderstood as someone who is racist and prejudiced for believing that GRE has any practical or scientific merit. Fast forward a few more months, sometime in the spring semester last year, in the midst of the COVID crisis, the Purdue Psychology Department began to consider several options for the upcoming grad admission cycle, which generated quite a bit of disagreements and discussions amongst some areas of the department. Do we want to keep the GRE requirement this year as well as for all the following years, or get rid of it in light of the disparate test results that's possibly perpetuating or even exacerbating the problems of racial and socioeconomic representations in higher education? So my guess is that all of this probably sounds rather familiar to you. Over the past year, we heard from a number of colleagues who are faculty members in other institutions, and we pretty much all seem to share the same struggles and challenges with addressing the questions and concerns about GRE. So my colleagues and I decided to do this recorded talk together in the hopes that what we're presenting here will be useful for those conversations about GRE and grad admissions more generally. One thing to note from the get-go is that we all want the same thing here. The goal we share is to make our admission process to be unbiased, fair, and valid to our best ability, which will go hand in hand with our collective efforts towards creating a truly equitable, diverse, and inclusive community in higher education. But even when we have the same goal, we often legitimately diverge on how this goal can be achieved and where do we look for solutions and improvements. And even within this author team, we have had multiple conversations and sometimes heated debates about the issues of fairness and validity. And I hope this presentation will be viewed not as a classroom teaching or instigating a mud fight, and definitely not a territorial battle amongst disciplines, but rather an invitation to a thoughtful and open-minded discussion to which everyone is invited to come and share their perspectives and ideas. Those who support the idea of removing the GRE requirement would say that the test has issues of bias, fairness / discrimination, and lack of validity. Therefore, getting rid of the test would help resolve these problems in grad admissions process, which will then lead to greater equity and fairness in higher education system. We respectfully disagree. Getting rid of GRE when there is no other good alternatives in place can be a dangerous idea. We think that there are real problems in other aspects of the grad admissions process that prevent us from making unbiased, fair, and valid admissions decisions. What does an accumulated body of scientific research show us about the bias, fairness, and validity of GRE? Are there any other alternatives to GRE that are superior in terms of these key issues? If GRE is out of the equation, and if we rely on the other major sources of information, such as undergraduate GPA, personal statement, resume, letters of recommendation, and interviews, will the problems of bias, fairness, and validity go away, or will they become even worse? So to answer these questions, we bring to you a psychometric perspective. Psychometrics is a study of psychological measurement, focusing on creating, evaluating, and improving a test or assessment protocol to achieve maximum fairness and validity when the test is used for a particular purpose, in this case, selection. So by the end of this presentation, we hope to have convinced you that the issues of bias, fairness, and validity are not only to be considered and investigated with GRE, but also with regard to all these other assessments we commonly use in grad admissions. We also hope to encourage an open and constructive conversation about what can and should be done to increase the quality of measurement in grad admissions to help achieve the goal we all share, which again is to have a grad admission system that is valid and effective in selecting for excellence and free from bias and prejudice and structural inequality, and to create an equitable, diverse, and inclusive learning environment for all students to succeed. And our presentation will be structured into 3 parts. In the first part, James will walk us through some of the key psychometric concepts and clarify what we mean by bias, fairness, and validity, amongst other things. And next, Melissa will present what the current literature tells us about the bias, fairness, and validity issues that's associated with 6 major sources of information that are widely used in grad admissions. Lastly, Luis and I will take turns to go over some practical steps toward improving grad admission decisions, as well as discussing some future research directions.
Great, thank you, Sang. As Sang noted, the first part here is going to focus on clarifying some of the concepts that we are going to rely on throughout the remainder of the talk. We wanted to devote a segment of the talk to these concepts because we think language is important, language matters. And so we want to make sure that we have kind of a common vocabulary when we start talking about something as important and as sensitive as graduate admissions, diversity, validity, fairness, and bias. As Sang noted, the perspective that we're presenting today is drawn from the psychometrics literature. This is a large literature. It's been around for well over 100 years. The primary resources for today's talk are the standards for educational and psychological testing, the uniform guidelines for employee selection, and the principles for the validation and use of personnel selection procedures. We're going to start with just kind of a basic description of what we mean by constructs and measures. Those of you that are in the social sciences or psychology are probably familiar with these terms. If you're in other disciplines, you may not have that same degree of familiarity. Basically, constructs represent kind of the abstract hypothetical construction, the hypothetical or theoretical variable that we're interested in measuring. And then the actual measurement of that we refer to as a measure, right? So we talk about criterion constructs as representing the outcomes, the outcome constructs that we're interested in. And so we might ultimately be selecting people into a graduate program because what we're trying to forecast or predict is how well they're going to acquire substantive expertise in their particular training program, methodological expertise, perhaps their commitment to the vocation. And we might index or measure those constructs during graduate school using outcome measures such as comprehensive exams or the number of publications or presentations that students might have, or the successful degree to completion or time to completion of the degree. And so in the example here, I'm going to rely on substantive expertise is what we're hoping the student will acquire in graduate training, and we're going to evaluate that using comprehensive exam scores. Just like we have outcome constructs, we have predictor constructs. And within the domain of industrial and organizational psychology, we sometimes abbreviate or label these predictor constructs KSAOs. And that's an abbreviation for knowledge, skills, abilities, and then other characteristics. And other characteristics is kind of a catch-all category that tends to include things related to personality, values, interests, those sorts of things. And so if I were interested in measuring the knowledge of the discipline as my predictor construct domain, I might rely on an undergraduate GPA or perhaps the GRE subject test. So in psychology, the GRE subject test is available, and it provides us or furnishes us with an evaluation of the extent to which students have that undergraduate kind of broad understanding of the discipline. Once we've identified the focal constructs that we're interested in measuring, and if we figured out how we want to measure them, the next thing that we oftentimes want to do is make sure that the predictors that we're using, in this case, the GRE subject test, provides us with information that yields valid inferences. And so validity is a concept that's not a property of a test. Validity is a property of an inference. And it really represents the extent to which the evidence that we've accumulated supports the types of inferences that we want to draw from those test scores. Within the context of admissions, criterion-related validity evidence is oftentimes one of the most important forms of validity evidence. And this type of validity evidence represents the strength of association between our predictor test and our criterion measure or criterion outcome. I put RYX and BYX up there. Those just simply denote, RYX denotes kind of a bivariate correlation. and BYX denotes an unstandardized regression coefficient. Those are two common ways that we index the association between predictors and criteria. Okay. So we understand now kind of what we mean by a construct and how we're going to measure it and the importance of validity. One of the things that we want to really make sure we're clear on is, what do we mean by bias? What exactly is bias? From a psychometric perspective, there are two different types of bias, and one form of bias is called measurement bias. And this is a problem that arises when essentially individuals who have the same kind of level of the latent trait or the construct. So two individuals have identical levels of knowledge of their discipline, but they end up actually obtaining different scores on an assessment of that's driven by their membership in a particular subgroup. Okay. And we can think of measurement bias as reflecting kind of the systematic contamination of a measure by irrelevant constructs. And so we might say that a predictor measure is suffering from measurement bias if it's contaminated by or is measuring things other than the construct that it's supposed to be measuring. An example of that is presented here on slide 12. And what we're showing here is on the abscissa, you have the kind of focal construct that we're interested in. So this is knowledge of one's discipline. And -3 to +3, you can just think of those as representing, if you're familiar with a z-score type of distribution, you can think of it as representing a normal z distribution. If you're not familiar with that, it's just low scores and high scores on that kind of construct. Okay. And then on the ordinate here, we have a particular item from a test that's supposed to measure that kind of expertise. So this is the GRE subject test. And the two curves are plotting the probability of correctly answering this particular item. Okay. And we say that measurement bias exists when membership in some particular subgroup results in systematically higher or lower scores, controlling for the level of the focal construct. And what we mean by controlling for the level of the focal construct is when individuals have the same level of the focal construct. So let's assume that the 0 point here is the average level of knowledge of the discipline. What we see is if the individuals that are taking this test come from group 2, right, the light gray group, they have about a 25% chance of getting that item correct when they have an average level of knowledge. But if you're in group 1, that doubles. You have a 50% chance of getting this item correct, even though the actual trait or construct that we're trying to measure, these two individuals have identical levels of it. And so this is a big problem. This is the type of bias that we want to avoid. What we want is a single curve that can be used to represent both groups. In order to minimize the likelihood of having those kinds of biases, we need to think about what is contributing to the variability in test scores. And so if you have a background in psychology or measurement, you're probably familiar with the different sources of variance that we can have. If you're not, that's okay. We're going to walk through it. And so when we think about test scores, when we think about variability in test scores, what we mean is that some people have low scores on that GRE subject test, and some people have high scores on that GRE subject test. Some of the variability that exists in that distribution of scores is just going to be random. It's going to be random error, measurement error, noise. And this is unavoidable. Such error, random error, is present in all measurement devices. It's unavoidable. We can't completely eliminate it, but we can try to minimize it. What we're going to try to maximize is what we call the systematic variance, and in particular, the true score variance. And that's just another name for kind of the construct score variance. And what we mean by that is we want to make sure that if we're measuring knowledge of the discipline, that what's explaining why some people have high scores and low scores is that some people have more knowledge or less knowledge of the discipline, right? We want that the variability in scores to really be driven as much as possible by true differences in knowledge of the discipline. What we want to avoid is the introduction of additional systematic biases. And one class of biases that the GRE can suffer from, as well as all of the other assessments that Melissa's going to discuss briefly, is content biases, okay? And content biases represent either the systematic contamination or inclusion of irrelevant information on the test, or the systematic exclusion or the deficiency of the test in measuring an important aspect of the construct. A second group of biases that are not likely to be present in the GRE, but are very likely to be present in all of the alternatives, are the social cognitive and potentially rater biases. And these represent a class of biases that are likely to engender potential measurement bias in these other alternative assessments. And there are literally, dozens. There's well over 100 different social cognitive and rater biases that have been identified by social psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and industrial psychologists. Examples of these would be things like a race bias or a gender bias, where we systematically inflate or deflate how we evaluate a person based upon their race or based upon their gender. But there's also more subtle things like a similar to me bias or an attractiveness bias, where I'm evaluating somebody more positively because they remind me of me, right? They're similar to me in some way, shape, or form. So we're trying to maximize the true differences that exist between people and minimize the error and completely eliminate these types of biases. There's a second type of bias. The first form we just reviewed really focuses on contamination in the measurement. A second type of bias refers to predictive bias. And this form of bias is represented in the relationship between our predictor measure and our criterion measure. And essentially, when we have predictive bias, what that means is the predictor measure does not have a single common relationship with the outcome, but instead it has multiple outcomes with the relationship, depending upon which group someone's in. And so this little graph here on the bottom of slide 14 is basically plotting regression lines. If you're familiar with regression, if you're not, just recognize that this is representing kind of a linear association between the subject scores for the GRE and the grade that someone gets on their comprehensive exam. And so the idea is that as subject scores increase, so too will comprehensive exam grade. So that's a positive association, which is what we would hope to see. But what we would hope not to see is this separate regression lines. So if you look at the two red lines, those are lines that have been plotted separately for group 1 and group 2. So this could be men and women. This could be white students versus black students. It could be any of those kinds of demographic groups. And what's happening here is if you happen to be in group 1, there's a steeper line indicating a stronger association between subject test scores and comprehensive exam scores. If you're in group 2, the line's a little bit flatter, indicating a weaker relationship. What we want is a single solid black line, a common line that represents everybody equally well. Okay. Related to this notion of bias is a concept of fairness. And while it's very easy to define measurement bias and predictive bias and validity and constructs and measures, it's a little bit more challenging to define fairness. And this is because those other concepts are psychometric concepts. Fairness is more of a psychosocial concept. And what that means is that what is judged to be fair by one person or one group of people may not be judged as fair by a different person or a different group of people, right? And so there's a lot of different ways that we can approach the conversation of fairness. From a psychometric perspective, there are some important elements that need to be considered when discussing whether the use of a test is fair or not. The first kind of condition is that we want to know that the assessment is free from measurement bias. We don't want there to be any contamination of our measure. The second is that we want to know that the relationship between the predictor and the criterion is the same for each group. So we want the absence of predictive bias. And then the third is that we want there to be equitable treatment present during testing. We want everybody to be treated equitably. That's how we think about fairness through that kind of psychometric lens. But there's also kind of broader considerations of fairness as well. And one of the things that we just want to remind our audience of is that beyond those kind of basic minimal psychometric requirements, all of the other alternative assessments that could be used in graduate admissions also suffer from issues related to this kind of broader societal concept of fairness, which includes things like disproportionate opportunities to improve on the assessment, or potentially group mean differences on the predictor assessment. And this will be, as Melissa will discuss, there's evidence of group mean differences on the GRE, but also on GPA, undergraduate research experience, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that we want to draw attention to and kind of put a caveat out there is that just because an assessment shows group mean differences, that does not automatically imply that the assessment is biased or that it's unfair or that it somehow lacks validity. A good example of this would be the screening test that we use to identify COVID-19. The CDC reported that, quote, there is evidence that some racial and ethnic minority groups are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. There are group mean differences in the effects that COVID-19 is having on different racial and ethnic groups. One option for interpreting those group mean differences could be that these tests, the COVID-19 screening test, is invalid, it's biased, and it's not fair. Right? Another option is that those group mean differences in the COVID rates across different racial and ethnic groups are simply reflecting broader systemic issues. There's a broader context that is kind of reflecting. Okay? And so banning COVID-19 tests because they reveal group mean differences is not going to address the underlying issues that engendered and caused those group mean differences. And we want you to be thinking about that with respect to the GRE and the alternatives. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Melissa.
All right, thank you for that, James. So using these principles that James discussed, we can use these to evaluate the predictors of graduate student success, the GRE, and also the currently available alternatives. But before we consider the alternatives, let's consider the GRE, both the good and the bad. By now, it is well established that the GRE has good criterion-related validity, which, if you recall from James' explanation earlier, means that the GRE is able to predict relevant outcomes. The verbal, quantitative, and subject GRE is able to predict graduate GPA, comprehensive exam scores, faculty ratings of performance. In fact, if you created a composite of the GRE verbal, quantitative, and subject exams, This would predict a little over 50% of the variance of a composite of graduate GPA and faculty ratings of graduate school performance. Now, the GRE does have weaker relationships with degree attainment, research productivity, and citation count, with perhaps the exception of the GRE subject exam. These criteria would likely benefit from the measurement of additional non-cognitive predictors such as motivation or, say, personality constructs such as conscientiousness. One thing to note is that these results are generally consistent across disciplines, and a more recent meta-analysis has shown that the GRE is a good predictor of graduate student success in both master's and doctorate programs. Of course, those who raise concerns about the GRE are much more concerned with issues of bias and fairness. The limited research to date has found no evidence of differential prediction for the GRE, but the data is a bit limited when it comes to the GRE. We do, however, have several studies using college admissions data to generalize from. In general, this research finds that the SAT tends to overpredict undergraduate GPAs for Black students compared to white students. In other words, undergraduate GPAs for Black students tend to be lower than what their SAT score would suggest. Thus, if we do away with standardized tests, this may actually end up disadvantaging underrepresented minority students. In terms of measurement bias, there's some evidence of differential item functioning on the GRE, but we would note that the Educational Testing Service frequently examines issues concerning differential item functioning, as well as other things, and will remove any problematic item unless that particular item's content is deemed essential for measuring that construct of interest. Although the GRE does not demonstrate bias, the racial and gender subgroup differences are concerning. Despite the racial and gender subgroup differences, though, there is a bit of hope. There's research suggesting that the representation of women and minorities in STEM fields has increased over time, despite these persistent differences, suggesting that the racial and gender gaps alone will not prevent minorities and women from attending graduate school. Other concerns have also been raised about the cost of the GRE and GRE preparatory classes. We would point out that there are fee waivers available for the GRE test, and testing companies frequently provide free or relatively inexpensive preparatory materials. The efficacy of test preparation classes is also a bit questionable, as they only tend to have a small impact on test scores anyway. These and other fairness concerns have led some to question whether we should abandon the GRE altogether. In response, we pose the questions of what alternatives does this really leave us with? How do they stack up with the GRE in terms of validity evidence? And do these alternatives pose other bias and fairness concerns? The first alternative we can consider is, of course, the undergraduate GPA. While the GRE is still an overall better predictor of graduate student success, undergraduate GPA still is quite well and adds incremental validity above and beyond the GRE. Similar to the GRE, undergraduate GPA tends to not be the best predictor of degree attainment. Of course, undergraduate GPA presents other issues. Not only is undergraduate GPA a cognitively loaded predictor like the GRE, it also presents the potential for sociocognitive bias when grading is more subjective. For example, Murphy and colleagues found that attractive females received higher grades than males when grading was more subjective, and this was even accounting for achievement scores. As with the GRE, GPA also demonstrates racial and gender subgroup differences. Roth and Bobko found that Black undergraduate students tended to have lower GPAs than white undergraduate students, and these subgroup differences tended to actually grow over the course of college. So while the cumulative GPA as sophomores was only about 2.21, the cumulative GPA for seniors ends up being about 0.78. And this cumulative undergraduate GPA for seniors is, of course, what we're going to be considering when we're looking into graduate admissions. Observed differences also depend on the field. We tend to see smaller subgroup differences in the liberal arts and larger subgroup differences in the sciences. When examining gender differences, Voyer and Voyer found that females overall tended to have higher undergraduate GPAs than males. But this is more likely true for disciplines in the humanities compared to math and science disciplines. In fact, they found no significant mean differences in GPA between males and females in the sciences. Another thing to note is that undergraduate GPAs have also been shown to have a small but significant correlation with socioeconomic status. Next on our list, personal statements overall lack a lot of validity evidence. They basically do not predict above and beyond the GRE. Additionally, although they are often used as an attempt to gauge writing ability, they have been shown to be a poor indicator of this, probably because personal statements are not standardized, and they also tend to be heavily edited by multiple others. And given the lack of standardization in these constructs, it's also difficult to gauge what constructs we're actually assessing or their construct validity. We're not sure when we look at these personal statements what exactly we're measuring. In terms of bias, content analyses have suggested that men tend to include more agentic language in self-promotion compared to women. What is unclear, however, is whether this agentic language actually impacts the outcome. In other words, we know that men use more agentic language in self-promotion, but we don't really know if this gives them an edge in the admissions process. Given the subjective and unstandardized nature of these assessments, it is likely, however, that they lend themselves to many sociocognitive biases, including identified in the psychological research. In terms of fairness, it is also important to acknowledge that there are essentially tricks of the trade to writing personal statements that undergraduate students may not be privy to and have unequal access to resources to obtaining these tricks of the trade. There's also a growing industry surrounding the editing and writing services that students of disadvantaged backgrounds may have less access to. When considering information taken from resumes and CVs that isn't redundant with predictors such as undergraduate GPA, admissions committees often consider where the individual attended undergrad and their relevant research experiences. Starting with undergraduate institution, it is currently unclear whether undergraduate institutional prestige impacts graduate student success. What is clear is that there's a lack of systematic research on how undergraduate institution influences our cognitive biases in the graduate school context. It is also clear that attending these more prestigious universities they tend to be very highly selective and also very expensive to attend. Additionally, Black and Hispanic students remain somewhat underrepresented at a lot of these elite universities. The next qualification often considered is, of course, research experience. In a recent meta-analysis, Miller and colleagues examined the relationship between research experience and graduate student success. What they found wasn't super encouraging. Research experience was not a significant predictor of graduate GPA, degree attainment, or research productivity, as all the confidence intervals in these cases included 0. Now, with that said, these analyses included between 2 and 8 studies, suggesting that more research on this topic is needed. The research that is available on research experience suggests that the research involvement is often viewed as a valuable experience for undergraduate students and has been shown to increase self-reported interest in graduate education and research readiness. Research experience is also perceived as particularly beneficial for increasing pipeline diversity, suggesting that it plays a potentially important role in increasing the diversity of our applicant pools. Now, with that said, we think it's relevant to consider who has access to research experiences and whether there are barriers to research involvement that may be unequally distributed across subgroups. To increase the diversity of our applicant pool, we really need to be ensuring that underrepresented minorities have access to research experience. Unlike some of our alternative predictors we talked to about up to this point, there's a bit more hope for letters of recommendation. Although letters of recommendation were not related to graduate GPA, they do show some minor incremental validity over the GRE and undergraduate GPA for predicting faculty ratings and degree attainment. This is promising because degree attainment in particular is an outcome that may be difficult to gauge with standardized tests and cognitive predictors alone. But the poor inter-rater reliability and lack of standardization limits the validity of these selection tools. Much like with personal statements, we aren't really sure what we are measuring with letters of recommendation. And as with any evaluation that's using human judgment, letters of recommendation lend themselves to a host of sociocognitive biases. Past research has found that evaluations of letters of recommendation may be biased by any number of variables, including but not limited to gender of the letter writer and language used. There's also a decent body of research that would suggest that there are race and gender differences in letter content. In research examining hiring faculty, women were described with more communal language, and they also received more of what these authors term doubt raisers. So this could be things such as weak praise, irrelevant information, general negativity. And these communal descriptions and certain doubt raisers were then found to negatively predict hiring decisions. Notably, this hasn't been examined in the graduate school context, but we can be sure that there are probably a host of sociocognitive biases being at play here. We also would suggest that students have unequal opportunities to build relationships with potential letter writers. For example, students who work, say, full-time in addition to attending school likely have limited time to participate in research, which is often the key for getting effective letters of recommendation. Last but not least, we can consider the graduate interview. The majority of what we know about interviews comes from the medical school context, which is arguably distinct from other types of graduate programs, not in the least how they do the interviews. We suspect that the lack of research conducted in the context of other types of graduate programs may be due simply to small sample sizes. As you are all probably very well aware, interviews for graduate admissions often takes place after the program has already narrowed down its list of applicants. Some programs do not use interviews as part of the selection process at all, instead using them more as a campus visit so that the students admitted can assess fit with the university. If an interview is included in the selection process, such interviews are often unstructured, and the interviewers are not given scores with which we could adequately assess validity evidence. For these reasons, it's currently unclear how well interviews predict graduate student success in PhD programs or what constructs are being measured. At this stage, industrial organizational psychologists have amassed a large body of research showing that unstructured interviews that lack standardization are likely to result in bias against certain groups. If in the graduate school context, there is limited research. However, one study found that higher body mass index resulted in fewer post-interview offers, suggesting that graduate interviews are by no means immune to potential biases. Some of these issues could, of course, be addressed by increased standardization. For example, in the medical school context, they use a series of structured mini interviews, which increase the fairness of interviews by ensuring that participants or in this case, applicants, receive a standardized process. Finally, we would note that requiring applicants to pay for travel expenses may be perceived as prohibitive for some. To summarize, there is a lack of research on many of these predictors used in graduate admissions currently, and in almost all areas, more research is needed. If we consider measurement and predictive bias, for example, only the GRE are we able to examine this. Conversely, sociocognitive biases are not applicable to the GRE, yet other predictors vary in the level of susceptibility to the large range of sociocognitive biases we have identified. There's also a lack of research on fairness for most of these predictors. While we know that there are racial and gender differences observed in the GRE and undergraduate GPA, we have much less information about the scale of racial and gender differences for other predictors. As noted, there are many real or perceived barriers for those of lower socioeconomic status as well. Finally, if we just simply consider the validity evidence, the available research suggests that the GRE followed by undergraduate GPA, is currently the strongest predictor of graduate student success we have available. Other alternative predictors either lack research or do not provide incremental validity beyond the GRE and undergraduate GPA. With that, I will now hand things off to Sang so we can discuss where we can go from here.
Thank you, Melissa. Right, so by now, I hope we have convinced you that GRE should be the least of our worries here. So when we rely on non-standardized methods of assessment, we're subjecting ourselves to a number of socio-cognitive biases that can significantly derail our pursuit of equity and fairness in grad admission process. So what do we do now to address these psychometric concerns of bias and validity of our assessments while also striving to achieve greater equity and diversity in higher education? So first and foremost, we think that it needs to start with having more diversified applicant pool with strong candidates for success by investing in a healthy pipeline of underrepresented minority students who are interested in our specific field of study. We need to be actively and aggressively looking for opportunities to help the students find what they're interested in and to help them develop the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics that are needed to succeed in graduate school. And many graduate programs across the country are now implementing a lot of different initiatives and recruitment programs, focusing on attracting minoritized applicants who are already interested in a given field of study and ready to send in their applicants in the near future. And this is definitely great news. But we say that the social justice advocacy efforts should begin at a much earlier stage. Invest in long-term academic and professional development programs and remove the socioeconomic barriers to getting the quality education and mentorship even before the students enter college and even after students enter the graduate program. Now, these long-term institutional changes are absolutely critical and fundamental to the goal of establishing social justice and equity in higher education. But they take time. So we want to also provide some initial suggestions and recommendations for those who are looking for ways to improve the status quo almost immediately. We suggest that each and every graduate programs implement more standardization and structure, and thus more objectivity to the existing assessments that rely on human judgments that are often biased and unreliable, and bring more transparency in mapping the link between predictor constructs of interest and methods of assessment. So to this point, each program can start by thinking about what you want to see in a competitive and strong candidate and making that information available to all potential applicants for maximum transparency. So what are the key attributes are you looking for? What knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics would predict success in your graduate program? So in IO psychology, we call this a person-oriented job analysis, or worker analysis or analysis of work. And there are lots of great resources and guidelines available for conducting such an analysis in a rigorous manner. Once you know what attributes you're looking for, then think about how each source of information included in the application can be used to measure those attributes. For each assessment method, create a grading rubric that is applicable to all applicants. For example, if advanced quantitative skills is on the key predictor list, then come up with a list of specific keywords that can be coded under that umbrella, such as R, SPSS, multivariate. And you can consider giving differential weights to different keywords. For example, proficiency in R can count more than a beginner level exposure to SPSS. We also recommend creating a construct by measure matrix that specifies how each construct is captured in each measures. So here's an example, like a hypothetical example. This kind of matrix can be further expanded into subdimensions under each construct. And you can also specify the level of content relevance for each measure for more nuanced assessments and information integration for the ultimate selection decisions. So as Melissa talked about, we want to minimize rater-specific social cognitive biases in evaluating personal statements, recommendation letters, resumes, and interviews. So in order to do that, we recommend conducting a frame of reference training so that all raters are on the same page about how to evaluate these materials using the same frame of reference. Again, this is a very common practice in IO psychology, and there are a number of useful guidelines and resources that you can use to learn how to do that. Now, we understand that some graduate programs may decide to completely overhaul their admissions system by developing a new set of methods for measuring the predictors identified from the previous step. Doing so requires substantial efforts. They can take up to several years. And again, we strongly recommend following the existing psychometric guidelines and principles for developing and validating tests and assessments for maximum validity and fairness. Next step is to decide how all information will be systematically recorded, assessed, and integrated. So the key word here is systematic. We recommend careful and consistent note-taking throughout the process. And instead of relying on the qualitative comments that are hard to aggregate systematically, we strongly recommend using a standardized numeric scale for evaluating candidates based on each source of information. Cut scores can be used for multiple hurdle selection decisions. For example, the admission committee may collectively decide on the minimum required undergrad GPA and GRE scores, which will then be used to identify candidates to be examined more closely, for example, through interviews. When you integrate multiple numeric scores from different raters and different sources of information, we recommend using a formula that can be consistently applied to all applications. We call this a mechanical integration method. You can give differential weights to individual measures. For example, you can decide that interview ratings should count more toward the overall evaluation of the applicant's motivation and conscientiousness compared to, say, letters of recommendation. But it is ideal to discuss openly and explicitly agree upon those weights before reviewing the application materials. That way, you can avoid the situation where someone tries to manipulate the formula to sway the final decision based on their own subjective and personal preferences. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Louis.
Thank you, Sang. So I'm going to be discussing future research directions. The first point is, to ensure that we are making the best decisions, we want to rely on evidence-based practices that are valid, unbiased, and fair. And as we have shown, we need a lot more research, especially on the use of non-GRE assessments, including GPA, personal statements, letters of recommendation, interviews, and CVs, where we know there are inherent social cognitive biases. There are also substantial financial burdens and issues of access for students on these types of assessments as well. On the criterion side, or what the admission assessments intend to predict, questions remain as to what we consider success in graduate school. We need to consider whether these measures of success are themselves biased or fair. For example, we know that there are differences in citation counts between men and women, and we need to have a more thoughtful discussion and also more empirical studies about whether such discrepancies come from systematic bias and inequities in higher education. As Sang mentioned, we believe that standardizing the assessment and decision-making process can help to reduce bias and unfairness and also increase transparency. But research needs to directly examine this issue of the extent implementing standardization helps improve the process. Finally, addressing validity, bias, and fairness is a continual process. We need to continuously evaluate our admissions process by cumulatively gathering data across institutions and programs to keep pushing for improvement. Doing so will again require more transparency and standardization in the way grad admission decisions are made for each program. In closing, we believe that many in the field of psychology and measurement can contribute to the continued research on this critical issue to improve the status quo of grad admissions. We hope that this presentation serves as a catalyst for meaningful and sustainable changes that are based on robust and rigorous science. If you are interested in learning more, please see our paper in the link below. Thank you so much for your attention.